Welcome everybody to the presented by Buried Above Ground, a new documentary about PTSD set to world premiere at film festivals this fall, and The Lens, a New Orleans area online news publication. My name is Chris Riley, and I'm the Outreach and Engagement Associate for Buried Above Ground. Today's discussion will bring together reporters and storytellers who have covered the Katrina story and its ongoing PTSD impact on residents, advocates, and change makers who have been inspiring and instrumental in rebuilding the city. It's all about PTSD since Katrina, highlighting trauma, survival, recovery, and resilience by Ben Selkow, director-producer for Buried Above Ground. Joining us today on the panel are Karen Gadbois, The Lens, who is our co-presenter for Heritage, a web that chronicles demolitions in the city, and a New Orleans resident and who was there at the time of the flood in 2005. Honorable Kelvin Johnson, retired judge, 17 years on the bench at Orleans Parish Criminal District Court. Jason Otis, New Orleans native, Katrina evacuee, Associate Creative Director at Peter Mayer Advertising. Jamie Roque, Nurse Practitioner, Louisiana Office of Public Health with a specialization in Preparedness. Chandra Thomas Whitfield, award-winning freelance journalist who did a number of multimedia projects for the 5th anniversary of Katrina. Wright Tom, senior editor, ESPN.com and ESPN the Magazine, formerly with the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Angela Tucker, animated filmmaker, producer and New Orleans resident post-Katrina. And Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, founder and director of the Trauma Stewardship Institute. Thank you all. Buried Above Ground is on social media. You can follow Ben Selkow and producer Mark Smolowitz. For Twitter, we're today and throughout the time we're using various hashtags. Hashtag Buried of Connection, PTSD, hashtag documentary. Also for today's hangout, hashtag Katrina, and hashtag Hurricane Katrina. / Buried Above Ground film, and our website is buriedaboveground.tv. Now I'm going to introduce Selkow. Ben is an award veteran documentary filmmaker and nonfiction television for social justice issues such as mental health conditions, trying to our veteran along with his of domestic violence. Buried Above Ground explores its subjects' lives over years, gaining access to their home life, therapy sessions, and efforts to rejoin their communities, all the while trying to unburden themselves from the crippling lack of their past traumas. The personal battles fought by Luis, Ashley, and Arundina illuminate a global health condition that is misunderstood, underreported, often untreated. Ben's past works include the documentary films A Summer in the Cage, which intimately looks at the Carrier, which looks at the prevention of a multi transmission in Zambia, Prayer for a Perfect Season, which follows an inner-city high school basketball team's run to the mythical national championship. He also has worked as a television director and/or producer on television docuseries such as Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown for CNN, and Rising Rebuilding Ground Zero.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today and taking time out of the middle of the workday amidst everything that's going on down there and in your own lives. Again, this assembly of people, some who are friends, some are colleagues and friends, some I'm meeting for the first time, really, it kind of echoes what the outreach efforts of the film really hope to do, which is create community through live or virtually live events and disrupt this crisis of connection, which I have found in the experience of making this film focusing on PTSD is one of the biggest casualties. Folks lose their ability to trust. Their negative symptoms force them to isolate and withdraw from other people, and therefore exacerbate the condition, extend the life of the negative symptoms. And this film hopes to, while creating compassion, raising awareness, is give an opportunity to create communities for people to connect and talk further on it. So this is a reflection of that and a kind of jump off to what we're doing with this film, both through live events and Google Hangouts like this. It's really a hallmark of our outreach. So again, many thanks for everyone joining. I'm really in some esteemed company. Extremely humbled to have all of you here. I want to turn this over to all of you guys as soon as possible, but I just want to contextualize my relationship with New Orleans. I went to college with Jason Otis's one of our panelists' cousin, and she was a transfer student. She got to college, and there was this blonde-haired, wild-eyed woman who I quickly found myself in a pickle with late night at a party, and that seemed to be a trend in our collegiate experience and very much beyond that. And quickly got to know her well, and two hallmark traits came through that I've seen echoed in the people I've met in New Orleans over time, in which case she was an incredible storyteller and she was incredibly loyal. And so those are attributes and characteristics that I really gravitated to, and we've maintained a friendship for over 20 years. Her pride for her city is another one, and then in 1999 she invited, I don't know, maybe 7 to 10 of us down for Jazz Fest. I came down for the first weekend, ended up staying through the second weekend, managed to find my soul and lose several organs, and so that began my real experience and love for the city of New Orleans. 2005 comes, and she's living in New York and is devastated, is displaced from her family, wondering what's going on, and there was a number of events and things like that up at Columbia. We saw Alvin Toussaint up there speak and musical performances, and so it became state of my mind. And so in 2008, when I began this film, I was really started at veteran populations, but as I was doing the research, really came across understanding post-traumatic stress disorder in the aftermath of man-made and natural disasters is a huge population that is rarely spoken about. And so I became, as a leitmotif and a theme to the film, is really thinking about aftermath, thinking about outliers, thinking about people who aren't given voice or spoken about enough. And so, I chose a subject in New Orleans to follow her experience and her journey to recovery. She was, I really was using, in the film, I was using the metaphor of war, which we were just beginning to understand through the veteran experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and trying to relate that to other populations involved with trauma and PTSD. And like it or not, the metaphor of war was so apt in the aftermath and duration of Katrina. The experiences were very similar. And unprompted, my subject in New Orleans, Ashley, used that metaphor for herself, that she really didn't ever feel comfortable talking to a clinician or a therapist unless they had seen war themselves. That was the only way she could find connection to seeking help or to relate her experience. It just wasn't, unless it was someone in her community or a peer, it really had to be someone who had been through war. So that's part of the framework of the film. I guess I want to ask the first. I've been reading a lot this week, in the last week leading up to this, and I came across this phrase, "carpet blogger," which I thought was interesting, and I probably applies to me in the sense that I came down from the north to ask questions, to look at this over a duration, not just for the 10th anniversary. I was obviously there much earlier than that, but so I guess I want to start this conversation to everyone is who gets to talk about Katrina? Who gets to talk about trauma? Who gets to talk about PTSD? Like, where Do you have to have a lived experience? Can you do it as an outsider? So, right, maybe you can start us off and help me understand who gets to talk about PTSD, mental health conditions, and trauma in Katrina.
I think, well, I think people from New Orleans and the Gulf Coast get to talk about Katrina, and to the extent that an anniversary story that gives people a voice is successful, I sort of start rolling my eyes and throwing up in my mouth when you see, I'm not going to name names, Anderson Cooper, but like when you see people try to make other people's trauma their own thing. And I just was hyper sensitive, and always have been. I lived in New Orleans long enough to know that I'm not from New Orleans, will never be from New Orleans, and should not pretend to know what it's like to be from New Orleans and have gone through there. And so you have to be very, very, very careful, I think.
Jason, as a lifelong resident and born and raised in New Orleans, who gets to talk about this story?
Sorry, you cut out. Are you asking me?
No, I was asking Jason Otis.
Jason, we can't hear you.
All right, when Jason gets back online, we'll return. Judge Johnson, who gets to talk about trauma, Katrina, mental health conditions, and trauma, other people's traumas in New Orleans? Who gets to talk about that? Who has the right to talk about that?
Well, and I hope you can hear me first. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can
sir.
you? Yeah, oh, very well. Well, it's hard to listen to people as they and now described as carpet bloggers, but to listen to people, and I have listened to so many who have talked to me through phone or through in so many different ways about Katrina and about what it was and how it was and how it affected us. And one of the things that I now say to people who ask the question, you can read about it, you can see pictures about it, you can see video on it, but you can't smell it. Those of us who were here when the water was here still smells it. And we can conjure up that smell. We can still, in our mind, we can see the brownness of it. Pictures don't necessarily show the brownness, how everything was brown. You can't see the fact that, or hear the fact that there were no birds. You see, there were no birds, you didn't hear them. There were no animals, you didn't see them. So you can't, in terms of then trying to really truly understand what it was about, you can't necessarily do that without having experienced it from that perspective. And so, yeah, I can talk about it, and I talk about it to lots of folk. I've written about it and all of that. But again, you can't necessarily understand it if you didn't smell it and you didn't see it.
And Ben, I was down there a couple of weeks ago with a woman named Maya Jones who works for ESPN, who's from New Orleans, and she was with her mother. If you've been to Jazz Fest, their family's the one that makes the Cajun jambalaya and the fried chicken. And so we were walking down around Esplanade, around the Old Mint, and they were gutting a house. And so there was a huge dumpster full of stuff they'd taken out of the house, and Maya and her mother both looked at each other because it was rotted wood, and it both immediately triggered for them the smell of when they got back to their house for the first time. And I just was like, to the judge's point, even though I was physically there, it didn't do the same thing to me that it did to them, and they were immediately back in their front yard in New Orleans East. And it was one of those moments where I just sort of wanted to dig a hole and disappear, because they were having this very personal moment that even though I was standing next to them, I was in no way involved in.
Karen, obviously, you've been there, you've reported, you talked about it, you witnessed it. All right, so let me graduate this a little bit. How can people who were not there participate in the conversation, talking about mental health, about post-traumatic stress disorder, about the aftermath of Katrina? Is there a way for people who were not witnesses to participate in the dialogue, as journalists, as bloggers, as writers, as citizens?
I mean, I'll just reference back to the carpet blogger comment just because it's I know where that started and how it started, and it was a group of bloggers who were coming down to what they called discover the ground truth, and they were very histrionic sort of. Well, at the same time, there was a strong community of people who were blogging about the sort of banal ground truths that we were all living, as well as the sort of more lurid ones. I think it's always important. It's interesting this week because everyone in town is talking about their PTSD. And I mentioned to someone the other night, an advocate who works in the field of mental health, that it's one of the few issues that people either jokingly reference it as if it's a lighthearted kind of thing. You don't say, "Oh my God, my schizophrenia is acting up." But I think people here all feel some level of lived trauma and reverberating trauma. How you talk about that, I think, is humor. Obviously, you referenced that earlier, but then looking a little deeper into what kinds of resonant impacts it has on not just you, but families, people who live around it. I know a woman I work with, a source, is constantly frustrated by her office mate who says, "Oh, it's 10 years, people should get over it." So it's a little hard to hear that because for many of us it feels like it's 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, across, certainly the key thing you would never say to a veteran is just get over it, and so, what I keep trying to do is apply the more socially accepted adages that are applied to veteran populations and apply them to the other populations. Obviously, the survivors of a natural or man-made disaster, and probably the largest population of PTSD survivors, which is domestic violence and child abuse and sexual assault trauma survivors. That's actually the largest numbers in the population, but those are the ones that have no witness besides the perpetrator and the survivor. So it becomes much harder to talk about it. There's no public record of it. So it's it's a nuanced thing that, where we have a live event that we can witness to it, we can talk about it. But I wanted to ask Chandra, obviously you covered it extensively for the 5th anniversary. How was your experience covering it? Were you treated as an insider, an outsider? How were you able to create a public dialogue and report on trauma and mental health issues in the wake of Katrina? Sorry, that was a question for Chandra, if she can hear. All right, I will throw it to Laura. Laura, in the aftermath of Katrina, obviously you work extensively with trauma and trauma recovery. How did you encounter, when you create a dialogue around this? What was your experience in creating that dialogue? Is it something that was well received, or was it not your lived experience more important, or how are you able to talk about it?
I think, building on what your colleagues are saying, is that, trying to be very, very clear about what one's intention is when talking about it. I'm not from New Orleans. I've spent time in New Orleans. I went down there to help in any way I could. What I've found in talking about it is that there's still so much isolation around it on so many levels, and I think with what one of the panelists has said about, there's that sentiment, I mean, particularly in the United States, not throughout the United States, but in many, many parts of the United States, of it's been this long since September 11th, it's been this long since Katrina, it's been this long since that hurricane, it's been this long since the school shooting. And, one of our strong suits in the United States, by and large, is not necessarily how to grieve, how to mourn, how to really be able to walk through that fire. And so I think the isolation that's there for so many people remains. I mean, that's one of the things that happens with trauma, one of the things that happens with grief and loss. And so what I hear from a lot of people is just how grateful they are to continue to have a space to talk about it and folks to continue to bear witness. And certainly, as everyone on the panel has said, people being very, very principled around the integrity, around what one's intention is, making sure it's not co-opting and objectifying and voyeuristic and all of that. But I think it's a very, very challenging thing for so many people in our society, where we do not give on any level the honor we need to for people, by and large, being able to grieve and mourn and be present with it as long as folks need to be present with it. And you can't. There is no rushing grief, and there's no rushing mourning, and it continues to come in waves. So I think that's been something that I've really, really noticed.
Yeah, I kind of echo that sentiment where I guess my point of view on making this film is that I'm sure it's not perfect. It doesn't intend to capture every perspective, obviously, but I'd rather be a part of contributing to a conversation, even if it's a little clunky, as long as like you said, you're clear about your intentions, your point of view, and transparent about where you're going with the conversation. Like if you're trying to generate dialogue and compassion, for me that's as an outsider, that gives me license to do it. Again, I'm not, like I said, I'm not trying to co-opt it or assume it was my experience. And frankly, there's this, what I've encountered too is there's a hierarchy of trauma. Well, if you evacuated, are you traumatized as much as if you stayed? If you were in the Superdome versus Uptown versus being in New Orleans and East, or on the other side in St. Bernard's Parish. So there becomes this like, who has the right to talk based on the severity or the acuity of the trauma? And I guess I'm of the mind to keep talking about it regardless. Angela, I wanted to ask you, I know you made a forthcoming piece as part of a 6-part series for Time.com on New Orleans 10 years later, and I saw you joke, or not joke, but to raise there's buzzwords that we use: memorial, anniversary, recovery, resilience, and we're using them ourselves in this. What's the language you've adopted? You've moved to New Orleans recently in the last few years for a variety of reasons, and in part to do this series, in part because it's a vibrant, cultural community. How are you find it navigating the language around the 10th anniversary and in meeting subjects, producing work with people in the field?
Well, I was at. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Okay. Yes.
I was at the Atlantic did a conference, a day-long conference, and there were many speakers and panelists. And one of my friends who works does social service work and was there to hear different panels made this joke when she was leaving where she said, welcome to Katrina Palooza. And I think there is this feeling here right now that we're just being kind of inundated with there are conferences every day, there's articles, there's and I'm having made a piece for Time magazine, I was really aware that I was going to be sort of contributing to a lot of what starts to feel like noise around the subject. I think it's really important that there also is space for people who, if they don't want to talk about their experiences during Katrina, they don't necessarily have to. And that's something that I've been noticing, that now that, yes, there is this open forum to have these conversations. I have friends who do various different work with different organizations who are doing rebuilding and things like that, and they say to me, well, I went into my job today and I had to talk to a journalist and I had to basically go through my entire experience evacuating, and I have to do this basically every day until all of the articles are done. And that really struck me as terms of forcing some people to relive this trauma. And and I think that's something that I've been experiencing and talking to people, that's really, really difficult. For my piece, I really tried, I worked with sort of 18-year-olds who were just graduating, and a lot of them were really interested to talk about, what their childhood was like, and it's sort of in the shadow of this event. They grew up over the past 10 years having to see how New Orleans has changed and grown, and how they're happy with some things and not happy with other things. So it's like everyone's saying, it's really trying to be as respectful as possible, but it is really a difficult time, and I think a lot of people are ready for this weekend to be over.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly with Ashley, who was the New Orleans subject of my film, who helped me over the years make the film and was always a great guide, and hospital southern hostess to me in New Orleans every time we came and filmed, but you know, I said I finished the film, and she's like, "That's great. I never want to see it. I really don't want to talk about it anymore." And especially, you know, a lot of folks anticipating the 10th anniversary and not wanting to not participate in a way. You know, like it has to live in a private way for some folks. Jamie, I wanted to ask you, you know, given your expertise in preparedness and as a nurse practitioner, should we be talking about it? Are we re-traumatizing it with this volume of the media loop, or this, you know, the images? You know, if you look at any of the articles written, the photography is incredible, but it's incredibly provocative. If we, you know, some people can glaze over it, other folks, you know, as Wright described, you know, are going to be triggered by this volume of stuff. Should we be talking about it, Jamie?
Well, I think, can you hear me, Ben?
Yep.
I think it depends on where you are in the healing process. I was at a meeting earlier today with a group of people from LSU Psychiatric Department, and we were talking to providers because, you know, we always talk about the people who were impacted. Well, we had a lot of providers that also experienced, you know, some PTSD just from working at the first responders. And we were talking about children, and because we had a lot of children in Baton Rouge that were transferred here and born here and stayed here. And one of the things that we were saying is that some of the people who work in the school said every time it's a hurricane season and they start talking about a hurricane in the Gulf, it's like a trigger for some of these kids to relive what happened during Katrina, and you know, it's difficult for them. So, are we still on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just didn't see anyone. So anyway, I think that you know, like us as providers, that some of the people around the table that felt comfortable talking, others didn't feel so comfortable talking. I think a lot of us were traumatized. I don't think that that's over yet. I do think that sometimes it's helpful for people to discuss their feelings with others, and sometimes people aren't ready. So I guess it just depends on where you are in the process.
Got it. So Jason, are you on? Jason, mic test?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're there, brother.
Okay.
Thanks for being on. You know, obviously as a native resident and someone who you know, had an intense experience during Katrina, who can be a part of this conversation, and who is, you know, who can participate? Who should participate?
It's funny. Angela said Katrina Palooza. That's a funny term. And I was thinking about, you know, there's a lot of people that live in New Orleans that hate Mardi Gras, and they travel. They go skiing or something during Mardi Gras week. And I think we're almost reaching the point of people leaving town for the Katrina anniversary. And I think part of it is just, you know, this is the 10th anniversary. We've had these conversations nationally 9 times, because we do it every year, right, to a lesser extent. And in New Orleans, we've had many more, because we have them. You know, it doesn't have to be an anniversary for us to talk about it. So I think for a lot of people, it's painful. It dredges up painful things. But I also think it's almost starting to feel like a cliche. You know, you've had this conversation many, many, many times. So me personally, I don't feel like my experience is intense with Katrina. I got out. You know. I wasn't trapped in an attic or wading through water. That's not, so my perspective is entirely different than, I mean, you talked about what is the experience required to talk about it. And I'm sure there's people across New Orleans that still need to talk about it and still need to work out issues associated with it. I find that the people that want to talk about it are the people outside of New Orleans. Anderson Coopers, or just, you know, people that are genuinely curious about how the city is doing. We here in New Orleans know how the city is doing. There's really nothing to talk about. This is the hand we were dealt, you know. So we're just living. So anyway, that's my perspective.
Got it. Thank you. I think if the video is queued up, if you guys will indulge me, we've got an 8.5-minute clip. It's just kind of like a super teaser of the film, and it includes kind of the mini sketches of all 3 characters. And that are involved that I followed for 6 years in the film. You know, a veteran from the Iraq War, a domestic violence survivor, and of course Ashley, who did evacuate during Katrina, but home was destroyed, and you'll see her experience in coming home. If you guys will indulge me, 8.5 minutes of your time. Hi, Chandra, are you back?
Yes.
Okay. Before we go to the video, I wanted to make sure you were able to participate in that part of the conversation because you were here, you know, around the 5th anniversary, reporting widely, wrote a number of articles. What was your experience reporting on the 5th anniversary, comparing it to now? Is, you know, who is the authorship? Who can participate in the public conversation around mental health recovery and Katrina?
Well, actually, I'd just like to add that I actually was in New Orleans last weekend because I actually am doing a 10th anniversary piece that will appear on NBCnews.com later today. And the focus of that is looking at Pontchartrain Park, which is an historic African American community in New Orleans where I grew up. So I wanted to let you know that I have been there recently, and I have been looking at it even from the 10th anniversary perspective. But one of the pieces I did for the 5th anniversary was a feature story for Essence Magazine about the lack of mental health professionals that have remained in New Orleans. And so I would like to add to the discussion that I think that the people who can speak on the mental health issues are first and foremost those who experienced Katrina, those who were part of it, those who experienced the challenges and the loss that that happened with Katrina. But as far as who should be participating in that, I think we should be encouraging those in the mental health community to speak up about the fact that there are a lot of people in New Orleans who are struggling with mental health issues, PTSD and depression and a lot of other things. And I also think that policymakers should be speaking on this because, as we know, experiencing a natural disaster and kind of all the experiences that come with that is definitely going to have an impact on your health. So I think the people who should be talking about it are those who experienced it. They should have a right to do that. And those who are in the mental health community should be speaking up, and the policymakers should be addressing that. And I just think it's a really important topic, and we should make sure that we keep this topic, you know, in the forefront, because a lot of people, you know, in New Orleans and outside of New Orleans have even expressed some concerns about they're tired of hearing about Katrina. And I was in New Orleans last weekend, and I even heard a lot of people who are victims saying they don't want to talk about it. So it's still a very touchy issue.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Before we go to the video, Judge Johnson, I wanted to ask you, you probably roll in the highest political circles of this group. I'm curious, you know, because there's, you know, the triage of the city, obviously, you know, the public safety, the displacement, the rebuilding of the levees. There's so many massive things to tackle from a financial, municipal point of view. Did mental health enter that conversation as part of, you know, quote unquote, the recovery, or how to prepare for the future, or as things were being rebuilt or reinvented? Where did mental health play in the kind of conversation at the municipal and higher up levels in the world you travel in?
It's played a part in all aspects of what we call recovery. The reality, of course, is that because of money and that part of a resource that we don't have enough of, then that has dictated to a large extent our ability to address those issues. We had a system devastated. Mm-hmm. That is that the healthcare system was devastated. Regardless of whether you're talking about physical health or you're talking about mental health, the system was devastated. And so you had to bring a system back. Now, the system that existed before the storm, one of the things that is just not correct in terms of New Orleans thought process is that the system before the storm was better or good. Nor it was neither better nor good. And so we had to try and create something since 2005 that was at least good. And so to some extent we've got to good. We've got to good because we now have community health centers We have a significant number of them providing that kind of care for people that never existed in New Orleans before. We have a mental health treatment system, outpatient system, that never existed before in terms of the kinds of care that's provided. That is, we have the state-of-the-art care in terms of ACT and FACT programs that provide care to the most seriously ill individuals. We have a crisis response team that responds 24/7. We have places that they can go. We do. We don't have enough of none of that. Mm-hmm. And nor do we have the kinds of connections that make a system work well. That is the connections between hospital care, regardless of what the extent of that care is, and the outpatient system. Mm-hmm. That no good connection. We don't have no connection at all between the jail, another place we find those who need care. We don't have any connection between that place and the care that exists outside of it. We haven't connected the other kinds of points where you can find the people who need the care to the care. That is shelters, that is those who are out on the street, that is. So we haven't done those things. And we have those things left to do. Another decade, Ben, and others, guys, when you all come back in 2025, and we're talking about 20 years after, hopefully we'll see better done those kinds of connections. But we're on a road at least to it. So arguably, we have got almost to good. So in other words, we're somewhere between bad and good in terms of the care we have, somewhere between bad and good.
I mean, I guess with that, you bring up the healthcare system that was blown up. Charity Hospital obviously lost hundreds of beds they had for psych inpatient care, and you've had to regenerate that in the rebuilding of community health centers and creating a connection. I'm curious, what was for folks that were down there during the storm in 2005 and in the 3 or 4 years afterwards, was post-traumatic stress disorder part of the lexicon? Was that part of the conversation? Obviously, people understand trauma and grief and depression and anxiety is kind of more standards of mental health care, but was PTSD a part of the conversation in the immediate aftermath of the storm and the 3 or 4 years afterwards? Anyone can take that one.
Well, I'm not an expert, I'm not a medical expert, but you're asking was it part of the conversation? I would say no. I mean, I heard a little bit of it in coverage when talking about kids and their experiences and how they're going to respond. I think, in my experience, PTSD entered the lexicon through the military, and experiences with suicide and returned veterans, suicide and depression and drug abuse and that sort of thing. So I think it does feel front and center now, and now it does feel like it's getting related to survivors of natural disaster and other things. But back then, 10 years ago, I voraciously read Katrina coverage and watched it, as an evacuee, and I didn't hear any talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you should bring that up. I mean, obviously, I gravitated towards the analogy of war, and the numbers, the incidence in the population over a lifetime is about 7 to 8%. Post Katrina, it was closer, in many surveys, it was around 21%, which is parallel to the numbers that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans were coming, and active duty soldiers were coming back with it. So, as you said, as it entered the lexicon around war, which was really front and center, in obviously 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, 08, the numbers are comparable to war, and that was something I was trying to draw upon. You kind of led us to that point naturally. For anyone else who was down there or covering it, what was the mental health and specifically PTSD conversation in the immediate aftermath, or were there too many other, Leviathan issues to tackle that mental health became a luxury or something that got pushed down? Chandra, what was your experience?
Well, I kind of agree with what you just said. I think that there were so many issues at the time, and that I think people were so overwhelmed with rebuilding and all the road home programs and where are we going to live and are we moving back. So I really think that the mental health aspect almost got, pushed down and pushed back because so many of those who were victims of Katrina essentially were overwhelmed with just trying to get their lives in order. And I mean, for there to even be a discussion about your mental health status, you basically had to have had a breakdown where that became the top priority versus the other things. So, and and also you have to look at, this is a population of people who, many people were not even accustomed to speaking about their mental health status prior to Katrina, and I don't think that changed just because it happened. But the good thing is there have been discussions about it, and as I said, I was in New Orleans last weekend, and just talking to some of the people, particularly those who were physically there when it happened, still a lot of tears, still a lot of really tough memories, and it's not forgotten.
I would like to jump in, if I may.
Please.
At the time of Katrina, my daughter was a freshman in high school, and when we returned to the city in December, when her school reopened, I went to the guidance counselor and asked what kind of services or interventions they had planned on doing, and she started crying. And so that was the first key indicator that we were in trouble. The second key indicator was when she sort of shrugged her shoulders, and we had at the time within the city a number of high-profile suicides. And when I asked, I referenced those suicides as a way of saying, this is an issue, this is a crisis, we need to be thinking about this in the schools. They then called my daughter into the office to do a suicide evaluation on her, which really pissed her off. But it was at one point I asked what the school was doing, and they said they had let LSU come in to do a survey. So they were charting the kids, they were taking information out, as I understood it, but there was no service offered an incoming service was not offered. Now, whether school had pushed back on it and made it not a priority, I don't know. But I do know that there were those of us here who, my home was flooded, and I also had cancer at the time, so I was preoccupied with a lot of things, but I did recognize that we had a generation of children, and we still have a generation of children, maybe two generations of kids at this point, who are severely impacted on all ranges of the socioeconomic scale. So the higher end folks, I think, seem to have an arrogance of not needing help, and the people on the lower end perhaps have a sense of there's nothing available to them even if they are to recognize it. So I see it as an ongoing generational issue.
Yeah, no, certainly the legacy of Katrina with respect to children, obviously the manifestations symptomatically are different than with adults and more complicated to treat. Yeah, I mean, that is, Judge Johnson talks about coming back in 10 or 15 years. The children of Katrina will be something to think about in the meantime, because, not unlike child abuse or sexual assault as a child, they manifest as different anxieties and different symptoms over the course of adulthood as you grow into adulthood that you may not realize the source until much later. And, hopefully, not with crisis as a part of the narrative, but for certain that is a legacy of Katrina that is not yet completely unpacked nor revealed. So, as of myself, as the carpet blogger, the idea of, am I allowed to talk about this? I say I'm going to talk about it because I see that as something that's going to happen, and something that to be considered and talked about, and make sure that dialogue continues and persists. Angelo, on the issue of children, I know you said you dealt with kids, 18-year-olds who were, part of the, that was their childhood. They were 7, 8 years old. Was mental health a part of your conversation, even off camera, or off the record, or outside of the narrative you were covering for your piece, or what was the narrative there?
It was interesting. I did ask some of them you know, if they, after Katrina, if they had talked to anyone. And there was, what was interesting is in the 4 students that I profile, 2 of them lived out in the West Bank, and their homes didn't receive very much damage, and they were very, very self-conscious about speaking because they felt as if they weren't a part of the narrative, and they just wanted it really clear that their experience was really different than other students' experiences. So that was an interesting thing that I didn't necessarily expect. As for the 2 students that I followed who were from Pontchartrain Park, you know, one student was very forthcoming with me about the trauma that he experienced, about needing to talk to a licensed professional, about he had a learning disability that they discovered when they went to Houston, and a lot of the anxiety and stress was sort of exacerbating it, and he's someone who feels as if he's still kind of starting to get his life together after what happened to him when he was so young. And he was kind of the most forthcoming about it. So everybody had really different experiences, and I was also very fascinated to talk to them about each of their educational paths, because some students, you know, one student, her life was pretty much the same in the sense of whether Katrina did or did not happen, and she said that. And another student was moved around in schools so many times. I mean, from when he was 8 to 18, he had gone to 5 different schools. So there was just a real diversity of experiences between each of the different students.
Jamie, I wanted to ask you about children and PTSD. You know, we kind of naturally segued to that idea, and I know you develop, part of what your work now is developing preparedness programs going forward. How would you respond differently, you know, in the future? Where does PTSD, mental health, fall into that preparedness plan and the hierarchy of need there? And then specifically around children, what is being proposed as things to implement to help ease that, you know, if there was something to happen again, God forbid?
Well, Ben, we've done a lot of work in preparedness, as you can imagine, from in 10 years, and I feel like the system is better. One of the things is in regards to, I wanted to agree with what Jason said about PTSD. It really wasn't a factor in adults. It was more an issue with children right after the fact. I happen to work at all of the, I guess they were called like trailer villages. We had Renaissance Village, Airport 1, 2, and 3 in Baton Rouge, and I worked in all of those places. I did mostly some primary care, but also assisted with doing like behavioral health assessments. And so people who qualify for services back then, the adults were more or less had like a major depression versus a PTSD, but there were services for children, and they were looking for a PTSD in children through that Children's Health Clinic. It was a van that came out of New York. And so what we've tried to do as far as that with children, we've done a lot. And I'll give you an example. Because we had such a large impact of children being separated from their families during Katrina, now we have like what one would call an unaccompanied minor shelter, which would be a shelter for children who have been separated from their parents, that are staffed by licensed social workers and people who have lots of experience working with kids. So that's something different. We didn't have that before. We just had just a regular kind of general population shelter and a medical special needs shelter. So we've done that. We've also identified in our medical special needs shelters for kids who are sick, we have like pediatric areas. We have more staffing related to children. We have more protocol related to kids. So we've really put a big focus on children, as before we were mostly focused on adults. So I think we've learned a lot, you know, getting supplies, infant supplies. We have homes for women who are pregnant so that they could get formula support, diapers. We've done a lot in this area to be able to, because we're a housing community and not so much an evacuee community, so we're preparing to take on people from the New Orleans area, you know, in the future events.
Great. Laura, I wanted to ask you, I read recently in an article this kind of theory of growth growth from trauma, growth from, and I would extend that to PTSD if provided there's some level of recovery. What is your experience or observations around, again, looking to the future in some ways, can growth come from trauma? Can growth come from, and I mean growth in the most abstract way or any way you want to define it, from those experiences?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, this is so much of what we talk about with trauma and what we talk about with vicarious trauma is how does one move through it and make any type of meaning possible, and how does one ultimately transform trauma, right? A lot of what we know is that it's so critical that folks aren't isolated. So again, we go back to the isolation piece. And you can be surrounded by 100 people and you can obviously be intensely isolated. So there's the isolation we look at in a lot of different ways. Another piece we look at with it is the ability, in the ability to transform it, is folks' ability to metabolize what they've experienced and what they've borne witness to. And that can be, we know that trauma can be such a time, it can get held in the fiber of one's being, can get held in one's muscles and one's cellular structure. It can get held, obviously, in the memories. But this is, part of what, so many of your colleagues are talking about here is if you don't have the space and you don't have the stillness and you don't have the capacity in any way to rest in any of this, then all of the trauma that one has been through, one has heard, one has experienced, one has borne witness to, it can really it can take root, and it can stay profoundly within one system, right? And certainly, my field, I have no expertise in epigenetics, but when you look at the field of epigenetics now, they're looking a lot about this intertransmission, right? So we talk a lot about the intertransmission systematic oppression. We talk a lot about the intertransmission of internalized oppression, the intertransmission of trauma. So when you're looking at this transmission generation after generation, so it's one thing to have it in one's life and, the 5-year anniversary and the 10-year anniversary and when it rains hard and when the wind blows. And then it's another piece that if there are not the conditions created for folks to be able to effectively metabolize and have whatever it is that we survive, so whether it's abuse, whether it's war, whether it's shootings in one's community, whether it's natural disasters, if we're not able to readily metabolize it, then there's a way it can very powerfully become stagnant in us, and it makes it incredibly hard to be present. And if one's not present, then it's also really, really hard to be able to emote and to feel and to allow any of this to come out of us and to purge any of it. And then what we're seeing now is how effectively that gets passed down, right? It can exude out to one's family and one community and in one's workplace, but then we're also really seeing what it means to be passed down. And we've known this. We've known it with slavery, and we've known it with the Holocaust, and we've known it with apartheid, and we've known this. And I think the fields of neuroscience are giving us a lot more windows in, and then this field of epigenetics as well.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Judge Johnson, in terms of looking ahead, obviously, you said we're somewhere between good and bad, and that's the right trajectory, right momentum. What is the growth that we can look forward to in the city, or what would you? Actually, let me change the question. What's not being talked about? What's the elephant in the room, specific to mental health and in the aftermath of Katrina, that's not being talked about? What is making people uncomfortable? What is embarrassing people? What is stigmatized? What aren't people talking about around mental health and Katrina?
Wow, that what isn't being talked about is a hard question to pinpoint. The children, as a guy who you're looking at who's almost 70 years old, children matter to me. And so people who look like me and age like me matters, but not nearly as much. And so when Jamie talked about having kids and having created something in Baton Rouge for unaccompanied children, what she's talking about, and literally, is homeless kids. So we know that we have a real issue with homelessness, and we have a real issue with homelessness as it affects that population. Yet we do not focus nearly enough on it, nor do we connect our newly structured school system in New Orleans, all charter. We don't do things directly to connect that chartered system with those kids. I'm sorry, with care for those kids that exist outside of that system, nor do the kid that exists outside of that system connect with that school, those chartered schools. So we are allowing a whole group of kids, a big pot of children, to grow up in this city who are really, as we use this term now, disconnected. We were allowing that, and we know it exists, and we're doing some, but from my perspective, not nearly enough to deal with that issue. And so it just seems to me, if anything good comes out of all of what we've suffered as regards Katrina, hopefully that good will come as regards children and how we deal with the impact of children in all aspects of care going forward for the next 10 years as regards children.
Right. I think you're picking, I mean, our tagline, with this film is Crisis of Connection, and trying to, I got that from Sebastian Younger, who is, a war correspondent. He's an alum of the university Angela and I went to, and, he's wrote an amazing article in Vanity Fair around it, and I co-opted that phrase because I found it so powerful. And it's echoing what you're saying along the lines of healthcare, along the lines of looking at the criminal justice and judicial system with respect to mental health, and certainly with children, and that this, creating connections, communication, again, these motifs that we're talking about here on an institutional level, echoing what needs to happen at a community level, are the kind of the growth we hope and should be part of the conversation going forward. So Chandra, for the 15th anniversary of Katrina, if there is in fact more memorials, anniversaries, commemorations, what have you, what will you be writing about and reporting on the 15th in New Orleans? What will be the narrative, or one of the narratives, around mental health and the 15th anniversary of Katrina?
Well, I'm hopeful that we will see the city closer to its original state, and as close as possible back to the flavor that we all associate with New Orleans. But I also that there is an infrastructure there in place where there are opportunities to receive referrals, treatments, etc., and something more widespread, something affordable, something accessible. And I'm hoping that we as we deal with and move forward from a national tragedy, that for those who would not or had never considered talking about mental health issues, I'm hoping that it opens up a dialogue, because sometimes it takes these type of situations to bring it to the forefront.
Great. All right. Just as a kind of a guideline of where we're at, we're almost up at our hour, so I'm going to kind of throw to everyone for a kind of a final thought on, I'm going to stick with the idea of growth out of trauma, growth out of disaster and tragedy, but feel free to, have your final coda as well. So I'm going to throw to everyone, and then optional, we're going to just throw this. We have a 2.5-minute trailer. We'll show at the very end to kind of take us out. Feel free to stay on, but if you have to get back to your day, that's fine too. So, so Jamie, what is the growth in a few sentences? And we could obviously all of us be on here for hours talking about this more. But what is the next step or growth in the next 5-10 years for New Orleans with respect to mental health? Where obviously you talked about the new programs regarding children. Mm-hmm. What is the next? What is the hope of growth, or what would you push towards growth, or what should the dialogue be around growth out of this?
Well, in the area of mental health, what I'd like to see happen is I'd like to see a comprehensive healthcare delivery system that takes care of the whole person, mentally and physically, and that people have connections and they have access. And I think that's what we really need to see in New Orleans.
Great. Jason, in terms of the growth out of this, is it ceasing to talk about it? Is it return to pre-Katrina, a city that's now it's down 150,000 people, and as Chandra said, it's lost the flavor, and that's principally 100,000 African Americans who have not been able to return back. What are you looking for in 5-10 years is part of the dialogue in the aftermath of Katrina? I know
I'm looking for the flavor, which is, in my opinion, a synonym for people. You know, I met somebody yesterday who her father's family is from Gentilly, her mother's family is from the Ninth Ward, huge family, and they're all in Houston now. And the woman I met, she was the only one that came back out of, I don't know, dozens of people. So I think that's what I want. That's growth for me in 5 years is those people, my friends who remain in places like Houston and Atlanta and Chicago, to be back. And for the city, I mean, it's like the city needs to earn those people back, you know? We need to build the city that can convince people that they can have it better here in their home than wherever they landed after Katrina. And how do we do that? I don't know. But I think one way that we can do it is by not having any more Katrina-level trauma events. And I think that when a shooting happens in a neighborhood, that's a Katrina-level trauma event. You're going to have PTSDs out of that. So, you know, and it doesn't have to be that you're the intended target of that shooting. You can just be the kid that's in the house next door, you know? And so we need a city with fewer of those, you know, and then we'll have better mental health outside of just treatment and, you know, mental health systems and that sort of thing.
Right. Laura, what is the growth out of this, you know, in the next 10 years?
I mean, I would, you know, I would not say what I think for New Orleans. I mean, I wouldn't presume to know. I know that. I mean, I can say with trauma, what we really try to support folks around trauma looking at is not getting caught up in the externalization of, you know, really balancing that you can strive for large-scale system change and you strive for large-scale political change and you strive for all that massive societal change, and simultaneously in no way do you hinge your well-being and you hinge your health and you hinge those who you love's health and wellness on what's happening externally. So I think it's a pretty precarious balance of, to whatever degree you have, you work for large-scale social change and social justice and environmental justice, and simultaneously you do anything you can to get through each day, right? And you cultivate those conditions so that when those waves of grief come and when those waves of loss come and when those waves of PTSD come, which they will continue to come, and they're not predictable largely, and they're in many ways out of our control, that you've got the capacity to let those wash over you, and you continue to metabolize it so you can show up to the best of your ability every day, and you be present, and you find beauty in the things that are beautiful, and you continue to let your heart break in all the ways your heart needs to break. And you know, you don't get into a competition of suffering around this, and you understand that there's no expiration date on heartbreak, you know?
Yeah, no, that's really well said. Beautiful. Angela, are you going to be in Brooklyn in 10 years, or are you just going to be in New Orleans in 10 years? You coming home, or are you staying down there?
Oh my God, that is the big question. I don't know. It's I don't know. I mean, I love this place, and there's a lot of great things about being here, but I'm born and raised in New York City, and I think living here has made me really understand how, like, where you're born is really becomes a part of your DNA in a way that you can't even predict. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
In terms of, you know, given the amount of exposure you have with kids, where do you see those kids in 10 years? What is their, you know, obviously it's a small case study, a small microcosm, and a varied set of experiences. What will be their legacy in 10 years?
Well, I mean, I think as with all, you know, kind of smart, precocious kids, I think they're all going to go in a lot of different directions, and a lot of it is really tied to where they think they can make their dreams come true. I think the growing film community here is very interesting to a lot of the students I talk to, because I specifically went to an art school, NOCA, and 2 of the students are filmmakers, and so for them, that's a growth that's very exciting to them, and so they can see themselves after leaving for college, coming back and wanting to be a part of that. So I think as kind of different areas show growth, a lot of those students will want to come back and come home and be a part of their community.
Right. Well, certainly, like I said, Sarah was the best storyteller I've ever heard, and more storytellers in the film medium coming from New Orleans I would be a big favor of that. Karen, and then and finally we'll conclude with Judge Johnson. Karen, what is the growth to look forward to out of tragedy, out of trauma, and again, I don't use those words glibly. I'm stricken with the gravitas of the days coming up, and I'm sympathetic to the folks that have to, be inundated with it when they don't want to be involuntarily. What is the growth that can come out of this?
Well, I think Jason put it best for me in terms of earning the return of residents who are as of yet unable to return. And I mean, I'll just quickly say there was a sort of halfway house, I'm not sure what it's called, an off-site home before Katrina down the block from me, and there was a guy named Kenny, and every day Kenny would come by my house and tell me what was up and who'd been on my porch and what was going on, and he was sort of the neighborhood sentinel. And I always say the town's not back to normal till Kenny's back, wherever Kenny ended up.
Yeah.
Those are not, the least among us are not burdens, but rather, contribute in a different way. So I think we need to rethink how we have demonized folks who are perhaps not celebrated, especially at this time of year during this anniversary event.
Finally, Judge Johnson, the growth, or in 5 years, are these connections that we're talking about making systemically, and then within, in the various communities, and then from community to community, are they on their way to being built? Are we, are you hopeful for those connections to be built, restored, and strengthened?
Clearly, we're making New Orleans better. On so many different levels, we're making New Orleans better. Yet we have to recognize what makes New Orleans unique, what makes people come to this town and want to be in this town, is what New Orleans historically has been. So we have to recognize that we want to be the best organized, the best resourced, the best structured Caribbean city. That's what we want. And so as we build forward to 2020, as we go to that date and time, hopefully we will have regained our population, brought those people back, but maintain who we are historically. Maintain the reason that so many people come here and so many people love this place so much. They don't love it because it looks like Atlanta or Houston or Dallas. They love it because it looks like New Orleans. And we need to make sure we maintain it such that it looks like New Orleans.
Wonderful. Before I pass this to Chris and we play the trailer, I just want to say, just a heartfelt thank you to everyone on the panel and joining us today, taking your time, adding your expertise, your insight, sharing your experiences. I'm deeply indebted, and I'm really proud to have hosted this and have you guys be a part of it. So deep thanks to everyone who made time in their day to participate. I hope that you'll continue the conversation with us on Facebook and in Twitter and any social media device you choose to employ, and share your thoughts and sentiments about this experience. And again, just a big thank you, and I look forward to collaborating and speaking and connecting with all of you in the future around this project or other ones. But a big thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Chris. She's going to play the 2.5-minute trailer to take us out. Again, just thank you very much for everyone for being a part of it today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ben. We'll go ahead and start running the trailer. And again, just on behalf of Buried Above Ground and The Lens, thank you to all our esteemed panelists for a truly meaningful and thoughtful discussion today. And thank you for joining and watching on our K10 Google Hangout. And we will go ahead and run.
good guys. Sort of shrug it off. That's not how it is in reality.
I've never evacuated for hurricane before. This like eerie silence, and it smelled like death. It looked like something out of the apocalypse. Now, got it. I would just take my best friend is the bottom.
Our society suffers from a don't ask, don't policy regarding trauma. It's a hidden epidemic. See the tip of the iceberg. I have anxiety, panic attacks, hypervigilance.
One neighbor died because of my habit.
I think about it every day. Throughout the day.
The war within ourselves, it doesn't go away like you're protecting yourself.
Veterans organization wanted to pair service dogs with disabled veterans.
Dogs outbreak or isolation. We need more service dogs for that.
Domestic violence, you go and you report it, it doesn't save you because they literally have to see you with a broken arm or black eye. Open the door. Discriminate. Open the door.
So many people don't have a clue.
How far am I willing to go to stay here?
Where is the war? Is it in Iraq? Or is it here on American soil? War is what I do.
I want to break this cycle. I don't want to pass this on to my son.
Something is hurting. You fight.